I always liked running at dawn. It gave me a quiet moment to recalibrate, to remind myself that the discipline and routine drilled into me during my time in special forces still mattered in civilian life. "Why don't you get a real job, Brian?" she snapped last week, her tone as cold as the untouched coffee she'd left on the kitchen counter. "You can't live off your glory days forever. Nobody cares about your little missions, or whatever you did over there." It stung, not because she was wrong, but because she knew exactly how to hit me where it hurt. The truth was, transitioning out of the military had been harder than I expected. But her disdain wasn't new. It had been building for months. She was working late more often, her phone always face down on the table. When I asked her about it, she'd roll her eyes and accuse me of being paranoid. It was the way she'd started smiling at her phone when she thought I wasn't looking that finally pushed me over the edge. That morning, I decided to test a hunch. It wasn't paranoia if I had proof, right? I waited until Sandra left for her yoga class, and then I did what any soldier would. I collected intel. I hacked into our home Wi-Fi, a skill I'd picked up in the field, and sifted through her messages. What I found turned my stomach. She wasn't just cheating. She was mocking me to this guy, some slimy realtor named Kevin. "Brian's so clueless." One text read, "All those years playing G.I. Joe, and he can't even see what's right in front of him." Another message made me clench my fists. "I'll divorce him after the house is in my name." She wasn't just having an affair. She was planning to destroy me. For a moment, I felt the old rage creep in, the kind of fire that used to keep me alive in hostile territory. But rage wasn't useful. Rage clouded judgment. No, I wouldn't let her win. If she thought she could humiliate me, strip me of everything I'd worked for, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. Revenge wouldn't be quick. It wouldn't be loud. It would be cold, calculated, and final. I sat at the kitchen table for hours after reading those messages, staring at the phone screen until the words blurred. Sandra was clever. She always prided herself on being 2 steps ahead of everyone. But she'd made one crucial mistake, underestimating me. I wasn't the man she thought I was, the man she mocked in her texts, calling me predictable and dull. The military had trained me to think 5, 10, 15 steps ahead, to anticipate my enemy's moves before they even made them. And now, she was my enemy. The first step was to act normal. If I confronted her right away, she'd deny everything. Maybe even twist the situation to make me look crazy. No, I needed her to feel safe, to believe I was still the clueless husband she'd been stringing along. When she got home that evening, I was in the garage working on my old motorcycle. She hated that bike, said it made me look like I was having a midlife crisis. I could hear her heels clicking on the floor as she walked through the house. "Brian, are you still tinkering with that thing? Honestly, when are you going to grow up?" I forced a laugh. "Maybe when I finally get it running again." "Sure," she said, already sounding bored. "Dinner's in the fridge. I'm going to bed early." I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before heading inside. That's when I started my plan. Step 1. Secure the assets. If she was planning to divorce me and take everything, I needed to make sure she wouldn't get the chance. I logged into our joint bank accounts and transferred most of the money into a private account she didn't know about. I left just enough in the joint account to keep her from getting suspicious. Next, I went through our documents, deeds, insurance policies, everything. I scanned and saved copies of anything that could come back to bite me later. It was tedious work, but I knew better than to leave loose ends. By the time I was done, it was nearly 3 a.m. Sandra was asleep, her phone charging on the nightstand. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. She looked peaceful, almost innocent. For a fleeting second, I wondered if I could just forgive her, let her go without any fallout. Then I remembered those texts. The smug smile on her face as she told Kevin I was too stupid to see what was happening. No, forgiveness wasn't an option. The next morning, Sandra was already gone when I woke up. She left a note on the counter. Something about meeting friends for brunch and running errands. I crumpled it up and tossed it in the trash without a second thought. Her absence gave me the perfect opportunity to take the next step. The goal wasn't just to protect myself. It was to dismantle her plans, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the life she thought she could build at my expense. The first move was Kevin. I knew his name, and a quick search online gave me everything else. His face, his business address, his social media profiles. He was exactly the kind of guy Sandra would fall for. Flashy, arrogant, the kind of man who probably spent more time grooming his beard than working. I needed leverage, something that would make Kevin regret ever crossing paths with my wife. I started with his social media. It didn't take long to find incriminating breadcrumbs. Pictures with women who weren't Sandra, posts that hinted at shady business dealings. Kevin had no idea that his Instagram captions were practically a confession. But I didn't stop there. I booked a meeting with one of his competitors, pretending to be a potential client. Over coffee, I casually mentioned Kevin's name and watched the other man's face darken. "Kevin's a snake," the competitor said. "Always cutting corners, making promises he can't keep. People like him give the rest of us a bad name." That was all I needed. If Sandra thought Kevin was her golden ticket, I'd make sure he was nothing but fool's gold by the time I was done. Step 2 was closer to home. Sandra was meticulous about her phone, but I'd spend enough nights awake at odd hours to know her passcode. While she was out, I unlocked it and scrolled through her messages. I wasn't just looking for dirt. I was building a dossier. Every smug text to Kevin, every lie she told me, every word that painted her as the manipulative, scheming woman she really was. By the time I was done, I had enough to ruin her. Enough to ruin them both. When Sandra came home that evening, I was sitting at the dining table, a glass of bourbon in my hand. She gave me a distracted smile as she kicked off her heels. "Long day?" I asked casually. "Yeah, brunch ran late, and traffic was awful. What about you?" "Just worked on the bike," I said, keeping my tone light. "You know me, boring as ever." She laughed. "Well, at least you're self-aware." She poured herself a glass of wine and went to the living room, her heels clicking against the floor. She had no idea that her perfectly constructed little world was already starting to crack. I followed her into the living room and sat down on the couch, pretending to watch TV. But my mind was already on the next phase. Tomorrow, I'd start to isolate her. She didn't know it yet, but the walls were already closing in. I spent the next few days acting like everything was normal. If Sandra noticed anything off, she didn't let on. She was too busy with her fake errands, her fake friends, and of course, her not-so-fake boyfriend. But behind the scenes, I was working relentlessly. Every spare moment I had went into sabotaging her plans. I wasn't reckless. I knew better than to tip my hand too early. Instead, I focused on chipping away at the foundation of her little empire, brick by carefully placed brick. The first step was Kevin's business. Armed with the information I'd gathered, I sent an anonymous tip to the real estate board, highlighting some of his questionable practices. I kept it professional, lacing the message with just enough detail to make it impossible to ignore. Next, I reached out to a few of his clients. Pretending to be a disgruntled former employee, I fed them just enough dirt to plant seeds of doubt. If Kevin thought he could snake his way into my life and ruin it, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. But I wasn't done yet. Sandra's name started popping up in Kevin's world, too. Little rumors here and there, whispers of a manipulative woman with a hidden agenda. I made sure the whispers were loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to seem organic. Meanwhile, I focused on Sandra. Every time she left the house, I went through her things. Her planner, her laptop, her email. It was all fair game. I found emails to a divorce lawyer, texts to Kevin about moving in together, even a draft of an email to my boss, subtly trashing my reputation. The draft was the final straw. She wasn't just planning to leave me. She was planning to destroy me. That night, I waited until Sandra went to bed before pulling out my old field journal. I flipped through its pages, scanning the diagrams and notes I'd made during my time in the Special Forces. The strategies we'd used to dismantle enemy operations overseas weren't so different from what I was doing now. The only difference was the battlefield. The next morning, Sandra found me in the garage, tinkering with the bike again. "You're up early," she said, sipping her coffee. "Couldn't sleep," I replied. She shrugged and headed back inside, oblivious to the fact that her entire world was on the verge of collapse. As the days went on, the cracks began to show. Kevin stopped replying to her texts as frequently. Sandra grew more irritable, snapping at me over the smallest things. Why don't you ever clean up after yourself? She barked one evening, gesturing to the empty coffee mug on the counter. Sorry, I said, keeping my voice calm. I'll get to it. But inside, I was smiling. This was exactly what I wanted. Frustration, confusion, and doubt. She was starting to feel the pressure, and I hadn't even begun to turn up the heat. That night, I sat down at my laptop and began drafting an email to her family. Sandra's family was the perfect target for my next move. They were old-school traditionalists, the kind of people who valued appearances above all else. Sandra had spent years building herself up as their golden child, a devoted daughter, the successful wife. I knew that if I played this right, I could rip that facade to shreds. The email was carefully crafted. It wasn't outright accusatory. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, I hinted at her behavior, weaving just enough truth into the message to make it undeniable. I attached a few screenshots of her text with Kevin, making sure to select the ones where she openly mocked her family's values. I thought you'd want to be aware, I wrote, signing it as an anonymous concerned party. Sandra's been making decisions that could have serious consequences for the family's reputation. It might be worth having a conversation with her before things spiral further. I sent it late at night, knowing they'd wake up to it first thing in the morning. By the next afternoon, Sandra's phone started buzzing incessantly. She looked irritated at first, then confused, and finally panicked as she answered a call from her mother. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice rising with each word. "That's ridiculous. Who told you that?" I could hear her mother's voice faintly on the other end, sharp and relentless. Sandra's eyes darted to me for a split second, but I kept my face blank, pretending to scroll through my phone as though I wasn't listening to every word. "I don't know where you're getting this from," she snapped into the phone, pacing the living room. "It's just someone trying to cause trouble. Don't believe everything you see." She spent the rest of the evening glued to her phone, frantically calling and texting, trying to do damage control. Meanwhile, I sat in the corner, silently watching her unravel. The next day, I took it a step further. I left an anonymous tip with her employer, forwarding them a few more screenshots, this time ones where she bragged about skipping work for her yoga sessions with Kevin. I made sure to mention how her behavior might reflect poorly on the company if it ever got out. By the end of the week, Sandra was a wreck. She'd been called into a meeting with HR, and her family had gone from being her biggest supporters to demanding answers. "Do you know anything about this?" she asked me one night, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "About what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "Someone's spreading lies about me, to my family, to my job. It's like someone's trying to ruin my life." I shrugged. "Sounds awful. You think Kevin might have said something to the wrong person?" Her face darkened at the mention of Kevin's name, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. "Kevin wouldn't do that," she said, but her tone lacked conviction. "Maybe not," I said, standing up and heading to the garage. "But it sounds like things are catching up to you." As I left her standing there, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Sandra was beginning to realize that her perfect little life was slipping through her fingers, and I was just getting started. Sandra wasn't the only one who needed to feel the weight of my revenge. Kevin, her knight in shining armor, was next. He might have thought he'd won, swooping in and stealing someone else's wife, but he had no idea the battle was far from over. The groundwork was already laid. The complaints to the real estate board, the whispers among his clients. Now, I just needed to apply a little more pressure. I started by sending an anonymous email to a local news outlet, detailing Kevin's shady business practices. I wasn't sure if they'd run the story, but even the threat of bad press could send ripples through his career. Then I dug deeper. Using a few contacts from my military days, I obtained some additional details about Kevin's finances. Turns out, he wasn't as clean as he liked to appear. There were discrepancies in his tax filings, payments under the table, and even a questionable investment in what looked like a front for laundering money. I passed all this information on to the appropriate authorities. Kevin was about to have more to worry about than keeping Sandra entertained. The real fun started when I hacked into Kevin's email. It wasn't hard. His password was embarrassingly simple, something along the lines of Kevin123, amateur. From there, I found what I was really looking for. Evidence of other women? Kevin wasn't just cheating on Sandra. He was juggling multiple women at once. Photos, flirty emails, hotel receipts. It was all there, just waiting to be used. I compiled everything into a neat little folder and sent it to Sandra from an anonymous email address. The subject line read, "For your information." She received it the next evening while we were watching TV. I noticed her stiffen as she opened her phone, her face going pale as she scrolled through the attachments. "What the hell is this?" she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's wrong?" I asked, pretending to be engrossed in the show. "Nothing," she said quickly, locking her phone and standing up. I need to make a call." She disappeared into the bedroom, her voice muffled as she shouted into the phone. It didn't take a genius to figure out who she was yelling at. By the time she came back out, her eyes were red and her hands were shaking. She didn't say a word to me, just grabbed a glass of wine and sat back down, staring blankly at the TV. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Fine," she snapped. "Just work stuff." She was lying, of course. Kevin had just fallen from his pedestal, and Sandra was starting to realize she'd hitched her wagon to a sinking ship. But the best part was yet to come. Sandra didn't sleep that night. I could hear her pacing the bedroom, her voice low and frantic as she whispered into her phone. Every so often, her tone would rise, sharp and angry, before dropping back into a desperate murmur. By morning, she looked like hell. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She tried to cover it with a quick swipe of foundation before heading out, but even that couldn't mask the toll. I let her leave without a word, knowing she was walking straight into a storm. Kevin was spiraling. The fallout from my anonymous tips had hit faster than I expected. By mid-morning, I'd received confirmation that the real estate board was launching an investigation into his practices. And from what I'd seen online, a few of his clients were already threatening lawsuits. That afternoon, Sandra came home early. She slammed the door behind her, her face flushed with anger. "This day has been a nightmare," she snapped, kicking off her heels and throwing her bag onto the couch. "Oh," I said, barely looking up from my laptop. "It's Kevin," she spat, as though the mere mention of his name left a bad taste in her mouth. "Some crazy clients are suing him, and now there's some kind of investigation. It's a witch hunt." I bit back a grin. "That's rough," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Maybe you should keep your distance until it blows over." She glared at me, her eyes narrowing. "Why would you say that?" I shrugged. "Just trying to help. You don't want to get caught up in his mess, do you?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she poured herself another glass of wine and disappeared into the bedroom. For the next few days, Sandra was a shell of her former self. The confident, sharp-tongued woman I'd once loved had been replaced by someone jumpy and unsure. She was glued to her phone, constantly texting or calling, but her conversations with Kevin grew shorter and more strained. One night, I overheard her yelling at him. "You said you had this under control," she hissed. "Now my name's getting dragged into this. Do you know how bad this looks for me?" I smiled to myself as I leaned back against the garage wall, listening to her unravel. She was finally starting to understand what it felt like to have her life dismantled piece by piece. But I wasn't done yet. The next step was to cut off her support system entirely. Sandra's family had already started pulling back from her after the email I'd sent, but they weren't completely severed yet. There was still a lifeline, a chance for her to rebuild trust. I couldn't let that happen. That night, after she'd fallen asleep, I sent another email to her parents. This one was more direct. I included screenshots of texts where she mocked their values, sneered at their advice, and called them overbearing fossils while venting to Kevin. I signed the email as a concerned acquaintance, ending it with, "I felt you should know what's being said about you behind your back. Family deserves honesty, don't you think?" It didn't take long for the fallout to hit. The next morning, Sandra's phone started buzzing while we were eating breakfast. She hesitated before picking up, glancing nervously in my direction as she answered. "Hi, Mom," she said, trying to sound cheerful. But within seconds, her face fell. "No, I don't know where you heard that." "What?" "No, that's not true." I sipped my coffee, watching as she went pale. You think I'd say something like that? Sandra's voice was rising, frantic now. That's ridiculous. Someone's trying to cause trouble. Why would you even believe this? Her mother must have said something cutting because Sandra's face crumpled. Fine, she snapped. Believe what you want. You know what? Maybe you're the problem. She ended the call with a sharp jab of her finger, throwing her phone onto the counter. I raised an eyebrow. Everything okay? Just my mother being her usual impossible self, she muttered, grabbing her coffee and stalking out of the room. Her usual defiance was there, but I could see it was hanging by a thread. Her family had always been her safety net, the people she turned to when things got tough. Now, that net was gone, and she was teetering on the edge. Meanwhile, Kevin was ghosting her. Whatever fantasy she built around him was starting to collapse. She sent him text after text, called him endlessly, but his responses were short, dismissive, if he bothered to respond at all. One night, I heard her crying in the bathroom. She didn't bother to hide it anymore. I don't understand, she sobbed into her phone, her voice shaking. Why are you doing this? You said you loved me. I didn't need to hear the other side of the conversation to know what was happening. Kevin was cutting his losses, and Sandra was starting to realize she was completely alone. But I wasn't done isolating her yet. The next day, I called a friend of mine from my military days, someone who owed me a favor. He was a tech wizard, the kind of guy who could make a social media account vanish like it never existed. By that evening, Sandra's Instagram and Facebook accounts had been hacked, her profiles wiped clean. She didn't notice at first, but when she tried to post a picture of her wine glass later that night, her face twisted in confusion. What the hell? She muttered, staring at her phone. Something wrong? I asked, feigning concern. My accounts, she said, her voice tight. They're gone. Everything's gone. That's weird, I said, keeping my tone casual. Maybe it's a glitch. She spent hours trying to recover them, her frustration mounting with every failed attempt. By the time she gave up, she looked like she was on the verge of breaking down. Sandra had no Kevin, no family, no social media to cry to. She was trapped in a world growing smaller by the day, and I was just getting started. Sandra was unraveling in front of me, and I could tell she was desperate to cling to anything she still had left. That was the beauty of it. I wasn't just dismantling her life. I was taking away her ability to rebuild it. But I wanted her to know. I wanted her to realize that this wasn't some random string of bad luck or an anonymous smear campaign. I wanted her to see that I was the architect of her downfall. The moment came one night after dinner. Sandra had barely touched her plate, sitting there with her wine glass in hand, staring blankly at the table. You've been quiet, I said, breaking the silence. Just tired, she murmured. Tired of what? I pressed, leaning back in my chair. Her eyes darted to me, wary. Why do you care? Because I've noticed a pattern lately, I said, keeping my tone light. You've been on edge. Things haven't been going your way. It's almost like, I don't know, karma catching up to you? She froze, her wine glass halfway to her lips. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her voice sharp. I stood up, taking my plate to the sink, deliberately calm. You tell me. You've been acting like the world is out to get you. But maybe it's just payback for all the lies. Her face turned pale, and I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. What are you talking about? I turned to face her, leaning casually against the counter. You think I didn't know? About Kevin? About the divorce you were planning? You thought you were so clever, Sandra. But you forgot one thing. I'm smarter than you. The color drained from her face completely, and for a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she didn't know what to say. You don't, she started, but I cut her off. Don't what? Don't know about the texts? The lawyer? The way you mocked me to that pathetic excuse of a man. I let out a humorless laugh. Sandra, I've known for months, and while you were busy playing games, I was dismantling everything you built, piece by piece. Her eyes widened in shock. You did this? You're the reason Kevin's in trouble? You're the reason my family? Yes, I said coldly, cutting her off again. It was me. Every missed deal, every call from your family, every late-night panic attack. That's all me, Sandra. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You're insane, she hissed. You've ruined everything. Do you think this makes you the better person? No, I said, my voice ice cold now. It just makes me the winner. For a moment, she looked like she might slap me, but instead, she grabbed her phone and stormed out of the room. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to, because the next phase was already in motion. Sandra didn't sleep that night. I could hear her in the guest bedroom, pacing back and forth, muttering to herself as she frantically tapped on her phone. She was probably texting Kevin or scrambling to do damage control with her family. But the walls were closing in, and there was nowhere left for her to run. The next morning, I set my plan into motion. It was time to deliver the final blow, the one that would leave her with nothing. Step 1 was the house. Sandra thought she was smart, planning to use me for financial security while she cozied up to Kevin. What she didn't realize was that I'd already taken steps to secure the property in my name. Months ago, I'd contacted my lawyer and ensured that the house and its equity were off limits in a divorce. Sandra had signed the papers without even reading them, too busy texting Kevin to notice the fine print. That afternoon, I made the call. I'd like to begin the eviction process, I told my lawyer. Effective immediately. By the time Sandra returned home, she was greeted with a certified letter waiting for her on the counter. I watched from the garage as she opened it, her face twisting in confusion, then fury, as she realized what it was. She stormed out to find me, holding the letter like it was a live grenade. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, shoving the paper in my face. "An eviction notice," I said, not bothering to hide the satisfaction in my voice. "You can't do this," she shouted. "This is my house too." "Actually, it's not," I replied calmly. "Check the deed. Your name's not on it anymore." She looked like she'd been slapped. You manipulated me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, Sandra," I said, stepping closer. "I outsmarted you. Big difference." She tried to argue, but her words faltered as the reality of her situation sank in. Step 2 was the money. I'd already moved most of the funds out of our joint account, leaving just enough to keep her from noticing earlier. Now, I transferred the last bit into my private account, effectively cutting her off completely. By the time she checked the account later that evening, she was livid. "Where's the money, Brian?" she screamed, slamming her phone down on the table. "Gone," I said simply. "Just like Kevin. Just like your family. Just like everything you thought you could take from me." Her hands were shaking as she glared at me, her eyes filled with rage and fear. "You're a monster," she spat. "No, Sandra," I said, leaning in close. "I'm just the man who finally gave you what you deserved." She packed her things that night, throwing clothes into a suitcase and slamming drawers as she muttered curses under her breath. But I didn't care. I'd won, and she knew it. By the time she walked out the door, she was nothing but a shadow of the woman who had tried to destroy me. And as I watched her drive away, I felt nothing but cold, quiet satisfaction.